Good afternoon, everybody. We might get started now. Before I start today, though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica Bean and I am chairperson of Patient Voice Initiative. I'm also a patient living with cystic fibrosis, and a lot of the motivation for the work I do at PVI is the need that I see in patient communities to have a more empowered involvement in decision makings that are made about their lives. In the last 12 months, we have all had to adapt, and the way that we work for PVI is this has meant that bringing our trainings online. From the turnout and the registration that we've seen today, I think this seems to be working really well. But if you have any thoughts or feedback on that, please don't hesitate to drop us an email and let us know. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors for making it possible to offer these events for free. I know that that's really important to being able to get patients and patient groups here. I feel particularly passionate about the topics included in this webinar series because I believe that the knowledge and capacity building within patient communities can support impactful collaboration that helps solve some of the problems and frustrations that we know exist in our healthcare system. And that's certainly the case with today's focus on uncertainty. Today we have two people who I know don't only have extensive knowledge about health technology assessment, but really strive to understand patient communities and seek the knowledge that exists within them that can help address those uncertainties that arise in assessing new medicines and treatments for reimbursement. Just before I hand over to our wonderful speakers, just a couple of housekeeping matters. We are hoping that you have lots of questions for our speakers, so please add them to the chat as we go. We don't want you to forget them. And our wonderful PVA coordinator and Single will facilitate those questions at the end. Please just try and keep those questions to the topics being discussed here today so that we all have an opportunity to learn. And with most of our online events, they are open to everybody, but our priority is supporting patients with opportunities to learn. So if you have a question and you're not from a patient community or a patient group, please, if you could just make sure that you include your name or your company and your organisation with that question so we can know how to prioritise those. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who really doesn't need any introduction. Jo Watson is the inaugural Deputy Chair of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, or Pbac, where she's been a consumer nominee since 2013. She's involved with a range of health committees, including as Chair of the HTA Consumer Consultative Committee and the Consumers Health Forum, where she's currently Deputy Chair. Jo has been a community representative and patient advocate in the Australian HIV response since the early 90s, including 16 years as the Executive Director of the National Association of People Living with HIV Australia. Please welcome Jo.
Okay, well, thanks everyone, and I'm really delighted to have been asked to join in again with the Patient Voice Initiative webinar. And today I've been asked to talk about this notion of uncertainty and how Pvac considers those aspects, as well as obviously what we do about trying to manage it all. So look, the term, if you like, or definition, or how you want to understand uncertainty is really in its literal sense. The expression is used in a very formal way within the notion of a health technology assessment, but basically it is about what is that we are unsure about, or that no one is able to say with a degree of total certainty. And so no surprises there, but I think what's interesting in the context of health technology assessment is that it can permeate its way through so many different components of an overall health technology evaluation, and for very different reasons. And so if you consider that health technology assessment is about looking at the drug or the device or vaccine or whatever, and looking at it from all aspects, so looking at all of its properties as a clinical interventions. So is it going to deliver health outcomes or improvements in health outcomes? The whole of that property or that item is going to be considered in terms of safety, in terms of its effectiveness or efficacy, the feasibility of it in terms of how it's going to be used and by who, and how it will fit within a health system, the indications for use or the criteria by which we put together an understanding of who best should be selected for something or should be appropriately prescribed something on the basis of the evidence of most optimal benefit or best bang for your buck. And then finally, cost, and in the Pbac's case especially, this notion of cost effectiveness as compared to something else. So if you're looking at all of those properties, as you can imagine, you're not going to have absolute 100% assurance and certainty about a lot of aspects of that, or indeed some aspects of all of that. And in the context of something being new, again, that's not exactly surprising either. So what does that all mean then? Well, in the context of an HTA evaluation, the uncertainty needs to be considered because it is there. And then you want to measure in a sort of rigorous way through the various experts and their evaluations what aspects of the uncertainty really matter and what aspects or parts of the submission are going to have uncertainty that is very difficult or very problematic. And then what can a committee or a Department of Health or an HTA agency do about that to try and manage the uncertainty according to where it is in the economics or where it is in the clinical evidence, and what sort of size or sort of impact that is having on the overall submission or proposal for purchase or for sale. And I think the final thing to say is that in and of itself, it's not wrong to have uncertainty. It's about how to understand it and how to fairly and reasonably say you can try and manage or resolve those issues or those worries and acknowledge it. Because the bigger problem is if it's not recognised or adjusted for. The bigger problem is if something's missed, because that can have a bad outcome in various ways. It could be good for the sponsor, it could be good for the buyer, but ultimately it's got a lot more risk and problems if we don't understand the consequences for the people that really matter, who are the patients. So I wanted to just briefly talk about evidence, and this is by no means an economics or an evaluation talk, and I'm not a health economist, but I wanted to, so I'm going to talk about this in a very sort of general or broad way, but evidence is, if you like, the inputs that come into submissions in a very critical way, and the evidence can come from various sources. Evidence is, as a number of you know too, are very much drawn from varying aspects of clinical evidence. So evidence could be the so-called high-grade evidence that you see from a number of large randomised controlled studies, the so-called gold standard of answering questions in the medical and clinical care space. But there's also more and more range of other ways to draw clinical evidence and evidence that can speak to clinical questions that may not always come from those sources of those phase 3 studies that are the more conventional and in many ways the standard. So assessing study results or data or clinical evidence in whatever form it comes still has to be assessed in terms of asking whether or not it's it's giving us information that is going to be fit for purpose, if you like, into the system and the population of which you want to see the medicine being considered for, or the medical device being able to be adopted. So when looking at whatever a submission
Sorry, Jo,
from a
you're just...
sponsor might have in terms of that evidence space of clinical data.
Sorry, Jo,
yes.
you're just breaking up a little bit. Do you want to turn off your screen and see if that just helps with the sound?
Sure.
Thanks.
So does that sound better? So does that sound better, Anne?
Yes, that's great, Jo.
Okay, so my point here is basically to say that in looking at the evidence and the data sets that are put into the submissions, part of the assessment process looks at the different methodologies and asks whether or not these points of evidence and the way these studies have been designed are actually contributing to the way we'd understand that evidence being relevant or appropriate for the clinical claims that are being made, as well as whether or not they're going to be fit for purpose in a system such as Australia's, and indeed for an Australian population. And I think common areas of uncertainty that I'll just try and summarise for today would be that we're looking at what the actual therapeutic impact is going to be in the real life of a patient or a patient population. And on that basis, the clinical trials and evidence tell us aspects of a picture that are done in a setting with clinical trial protocols and a range of supports and features. So what then can be said about what we think is going to be the way that a medicine may be used in the clinical setting, and how patients as a population are going to be able to be supported to getting the most optimal benefit from those new therapies in the real world setting. And how the medicine's going to be used in terms of clinical practice isn't just about that between the prescriber and the patient, but also how the system's going to be able to be adapted and adopted for whatever may be unique features of dispensing or implementation or delivery, and indeed dealing with the restrictions or the conditions or the criteria of which the committee wants to think about putting there as part of the features of that listing. And so will the overall cost impact with a public listing on something such as a pharmaceutical benefits scheme, will that actually be an overall cost impact that's been well articulated and substantiated in the submission, or is that something that still has some questions attached to it in terms of what really would be uptake and treatment duration scenarios? So you're looking at what is missing in available data, the so-called Rumsfeld notion of what is the known unknowns, and indeed what can we do about them. And finally, I think in terms of those economic aspects where you're trying to look at ways that values of quality of life, utilities or measurements are made on particular patient groups, and the way that the treatments are going to support the clinical management of that disease or condition, is the quality of life values and the validity of those as they were possibly captured in a clinical trial setting. Are they the ones that really matter to patients in real life? Are they also the real population that we have here in Australia in terms of the characteristics and the demographics? And are they going to be things that we can say with certainty help us understand then those things that matter most to patients in our country? So I think about this almost as a string of sausages in some way, and putting those together in the butcher shop. So if you're thinking about all the inputs that can go into supporting the claim and the position and the basis for saying, here's a new drug, this is why we think it's going to make a difference, this is why we think it's a critical medicine to now list on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, or this is going to be a critical device that should be considered, or this should be a critical service or intervention that we want to see in our health system. If you think of all the clinical evidence and all the economic evidence that can go into that submission as the what, then in my opinion, the how that's all going to be dealt with is the health technology assessment process. That's the evaluation. So as it goes through all the critical analysis and assessment by various experts and those in the field of health economics or clinical expertise or epidemiological expertise or whatever, that the throughput is what we end up with, saying whether or not it's your Bunnings sausage sizzle or it's your gourmet delicatessen. And then at that point, you've got the output, and that's what I consider to be, so what is the real impact of this? If we accept that uncertainty in and of itself isn't a wrong thing, it's not something that you'll ever totally be able to get rid of, then how do we manage it in the best way? And what are the uncertainties that we can live with, and what are the uncertainties that are posing more critical issues of worry or concern, or present risk in the eyes of a decision-making body or ultimately the payer, whether that be a government or an insurance agency or whatever. And so that interplay, if you like, about how all of that is handled becomes the, I guess, the meat of how we see health technology assessment, and then finally deliberation and decision-making play out with a sort of a delicate balance. And I think the sources and the reasons why you've got uncertainty in some ways is only part of the story, because then it's ways there's sort of more important areas of uncertainty that are real sort of deal makers or breakers. And so in terms of managing uncertainty, I think there are various approaches, but I've just listed a few here that are probably more commonly known or understood, not just here in Australia, but around the world. And so there may be a situation where a health technology assessment agency will just say, well, look, sorry, this submission has too many unknowns or uncertainties that we just can't resolve in the current way that this proposition or this submission is before us. So that requires a range of work that the sponsor or manufacturer is asked to go and do to rework up a new model or a new claim, to refine, if you like, some of those major sort of areas where the uncertainty may be really crippling a way that it can be progressed. And then once it's resubmitted, a new evaluation is taken out that's hopefully going to see things reduce or mitigate that uncertainty and that risk. I think then other ways that things are tried to manage uncertainty that may not need something as significant as a total reworking would be where you see recommendations made by committees where there's a talk of this notion of sharing risk. So a recommendation can be made if there's some agreements around managed access programs or special pricing arrangements. So managed access programs where something may be listed, but in a way where data continues to be collected and health outcomes are measured, and there's a level of security for the payer in the sense that there would be rebates written in to help offset costs if things are not able to be achieved in the way that has initially been promoted. Special pricing arrangements where basically, it looks like I'm buying X from you, but every time I buy X from you, you actually give me 3 of those X's. And then finally, whether or not submissions in certain critical aspects can be adjusted to support better a claim or proposed listing parameter, and that will a number of issues in a more direct way, and will be enough to satisfy the decision makers that something can go forward. So what else finally can help reassure? Well, I think, as I said at the beginning, there's a range of different sources of information and evidence and data sets that can be brought before a committee, and clinical experience and patient evidence are also alternative sources of evidence that especially are critical if they can speak to some of these areas of uncertainty in a very sort of considered way. And we've seen several examples over time within the Pbac context where that Australian sort of inputs quite specifically to some of those areas of uncertainty for a specific submission have been very useful, and in my opinion have helped get something across the line. I think that that notion of monitoring or watching the way the future use of something when it first comes into the system helps in terms of just testing whether or not some outcomes are realised in the way that they've been proposed, and it gives that first access period insight, if you like, to how something is going to be acceptable and feasible within the Australian context. And the Drug Utilisation Subcommittee of Pbac, for instance, does do regular reviews on behalf of Pbac of a number of new listings within the first 24 months, just for that reason and to get that sort of information back. Horizon scanning becomes very important, especially in the context of understanding what might be new breakthrough therapies or interventions coming further down in the future. How then should we be considering things in the sense of what is here, what is a clinical need, and what else might be coming to either become a complementary or a additional use to the way that a disease or condition in a patient population can be managed with a more fulsome sort of understanding of the whole sort of clinical landscape in that way. And then finally, I think there's also a lot of discussions and considerations here and overseas about how health technology assessments can try and be more focused and help identify what it is going to be the more useful or the more critical evidence or additional data that is needed in a particular context or assessment setting. So rather than just more and more clinical trial data of particular things that are really comparing apples or oranges, what is it that's going to be the generation of evidence that's really going to be something that all the health technology assessment processes is really looking for to support considerations. But I say that with the caveat there that you obviously want to be reasonable about thinking about that in a time frame that's not going to see delays at an unreasonable sort of context. So this is my concluding slide. I just want to sum up by saying I think uncertainty is really uncertainties, and it's across very different aspects in different components of any HTA assessment, and with all the available inputs that sponsor is able to provide. And there are always going to be some uncertainties at some level. The processes for dealing with uncertainty, I think, are really what's the exciting area of understanding how systems and health systems and the support structures can deal with uncertainties in a way that's reasonable for both those who are bringing something forward for subsidy and those who are are waiting to receive the benefit of that intervention. There are various types and levels of uncertainty within an HTA process, and they can differ according to each and every item. So there's never going to be a one-shop sort of answer to all of this. The clinical evidence and the economic model data provided by a sponsor are all considered together to bring a comprehensive picture, and they're assessed testing various claims and scenarios. So these are complex sort of processes, and as you all know, that's what often is behind the 17-week cycle of considering something for a Pvac agenda. And so the data provided by a sponsor is considered and really tested, if you like, across many ways, not just through health economics, not just through finance, but not just through clinical expertise, but all the components together. And then finally, I think we should be saying that that the uncertainties will affect not only how the HTA deliberations consider they can resolve or reject what's been put before them, but also it's important that people understand that there's also a lot of effort that goes into managing uncertainty in a way that can be considered reasonable and pragmatic. And that's what speaks then to the consistency and transparency of the overall process. So I'll leave it there, and Anne and Jessica, thank you.
No, thank you, Jo. It's always so wonderful to hear from you, and I absolutely learn something every time. I don't know that anybody else could manage to work in bunny sausages to a presentation on health technology assessment, but that was a fantastic way to explain it. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to our audience to please continue to pop your questions in the question box. I know that it's a great opportunity to have both Jo and Nicole, so don't waste that and ask any of the questions that you have as burning questions. With that, I will move on to our next fantastic speaker. Again, she really doesn't need an introduction because most of you will also know Nicole. Nicole is the Chief Executive Officer of Rare Voices Australia. She's a qualified social worker with both personal and professional experience in the rare disease sector, including more than 12 years in rare disease advocacy, particularly regarding access to treatments. Since 2018, Nicole has held the role of consumer nominee on the Life-Saving Drugs program expert panel, and under Nicole's guidance, Rare Voices Australia has led the collaborative development of the National Strategic Action Plan for Rare Diseases, which is Australia's first nationally coordinated effort to address rare diseases. Thank you so much for making the time, Nicole. I hope that your voice is feeling up to the presentation, but I know that you'll have some wonderful things to share. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. And yes, I do apologise for my croaky voice, but I didn't have any voice at all on Tuesday. So anyway, I'm sure we will manage through. Thanks for your tolerance of it. Now I'm just going to share my screen. Oh. That's it. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen there.
Yes, it's okay, good.
Great. So look, firstly, thank you to Jess and to Anne and the rest of the team at Patient Voice Initiative. Rare Voices Australia is very pleased to be able to collaborate with PVI on this webinar series. And I'm certainly very proud to be sharing the stage, as it were, with Jo Watson. Jo and I have done some really good work together over the years. Sorry, I've just lost, where is it? Oh, there it is. Sorry, I'm right now. Okay, so like many in the rare disease sector, I wear many hats. I have both lived experience and professional expertise. And in regards to HTA, I also wear multiple hats. I'm a consumer, an advocate. RVA is the national peak body for Australians living with a rare disease. As part of our work, that includes provision of HTA strategy. It also includes mentorship and support to rare disease patient groups, and a lot of that centres around HTA. RVA also successfully advocated for the Life-Saving Drug Program reform and actively contributed to the detailed guidance to progress this with the Department of Health and Industry. As Jess said, I now sit on an HTA committee, the Life Saving Drug Program Expert Panel. And I think the strength of multiple hats, or many hats, I think, is that it allows us or encourages us to teach others at the same time that we are learning from others. And I think that's really important, especially in the context of HTA. So limited data is an inherent and common feature of rare diseases. And this often results in high uncertainty, which impacts on every part of people's lives. People are faced with difficult choices, with incomplete knowledge and often unclear pathways. So when 20 years ago my son was diagnosed with a rare disease, all I had were questions and very few answers. Why did this happen? How do I fix it? What do I do? Where do I go? And will he have a future, and what will it look like? There are limited treatment options in rare disease. And even when a treatment does exist, financial support or funding might not be available in Australia. And as such, access is often limited. Funding, or the reimbursement of health technologies for rare diseases, using models designed for more common diseases, is challenging. The smaller patient numbers of rare disease impact on cost effectiveness, and there is often less clinical evidence available due to the challenges of conducting large-scale clinical trials, for example. There is often in rare disease less clinical data. About 7 years ago, I had a conversation with a key Department of Health representative. He said to me, "Nicole, all you rare disease people, you keep asking for us to fund medicines on less evidence, less data. But that's not fair to rare disease patients," she told me. "Why should they get lesser quality medicines? They should get the same quality medicines as everyone else." Now, while I certainly agree that less data equals more uncertainties, I'm not really sure that that then equates or really leads to lesser quality medicines. So what is the impact of uncertainties at Pbac? And Joe's talked to this a bit already. But I think in sort of fairly basic terms, what it means is that the impact of uncertainty can mean that a Pbac recommend a deferral, or they make a decision not to recommend. The impact of uncertainty can mean that a medicine is approved, but only for a subset of patients, not for all of them. I've also seen where the impact of uncertainty will mean that an medicine may be approved, but as a second-line treatment. What the uncertainty does mean is that there is a longer process from application to patients accessing treatment. It most definitely impacts on the time to access. It could mean that pharma companies do not resubmit. What happens then? Perhaps it means that pharma companies do not prioritise Australian markets in the future. But what it definitely means is that there's no access to treatment. And what does this really mean? Well, as I explained to that Department of Health representative that I spoke about before, rare disease patients aren't just able to sit patiently for more data or for more evidence to become available. And living with a rare disease is not a passive experience. Rare diseases are often progressive and life-limiting. So without access to treatment, what we see is deterioration, and often that is irreversible. The impact of uncertainties and the delay can actually mean patients are missing out on really critical treatment windows, and it certainly means poorer patient outcomes. Someone else that I know, and this time someone working in the pharma industry, the other week was telling me that their company was about to present at the public hearing of the parliamentary inquiry into approval processes for new medicines or new drugs and novel medical technologies. And this pharma representative was briefing me about what they were going to say. And I think what they were hoping for was my or RVA's endorsement. But what happened was that this woman said in a very offhand way, we're making this recommendation in response to, you know, Nicole, how Pbac are not able to cope with any uncertainty. So I pulled her up on this quite strongly and noted to her that this messaging was neither strategic and nor was it accurate. And that, as Jo already herself has said in her talk, actually managing or resolving uncertainty is arguably a key part of what the Pbac do, indeed any HTA process. A process which at the very heart of it is to seek certain data to reduce uncertainty. So data, for example, demonstrating clinical effectiveness, economic modelling, population estimates, quality of life measures. And as Jo also talked about, if they are still not sure, they will defer or not recommend, providing companies with feedback on what data was missing or uncertain, and companies are welcome to resubmit or try again. So Pbac does have a process for handling uncertainties, but I would argue there is a lot of room for improvement, particularly for rare disease medicine. So RVA has consistently called for such high-level system improvements. And I just thought I would share some of this messaging today. I think particularly in the area of rare disease, what I would love to see is that we reduce the reliance on resubmissions to resolve uncertainty. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could just get all the evidence we need the first time round? And I say that a bit facetiously, but not really. I think there's actually ways that we can make that much more likely. One of those ways is in recognition that there is often less clinical data in rare disease, that our systems prioritise alternate forms of data and evidence where required. And in recognition of the complexity of rare diseases, it's really important that we embed informed stakeholder input in the process as early as possible. And I would argue actually before the time the company puts in an application. There should be stakeholder input at that early stage and throughout the whole process. We need more stakeholder meetings with expert patient and expert clinician input. Now, these do happen from time to time through the PBS or Pbac process, the HTA process. But what we need is for these to be more routine and transparent and accessible. Because think what we could do, or how amazing it would be if we could highlight the data gaps and evidence challenges early on in the process and get all the right people in the room so we can problem solve potential solutions. It would make such a difference. Okay, so as I said, they were higher level asks, I guess, for systemic reform. But what can patients do now? What can patients do currently to help the Pbac resolve or reduce uncertainty? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say may be a bit controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. Patient groups need to show up and step up. Advocacy for access to medicines should be a key role or focus for every single patient group. And because if they do not do it, no one else will. So to all your patient group, the patient group leaders in this audience, it is your job. Now, before a patient group leader can effectively advocate for medicine, patient group leaders need to have a good working knowledge of how medicines are funded in Australia. So that includes the Pbac, it includes MSAC, and often in the rare disease sector, it includes the life-saving drug program. Patient group leaders need to have a really good understanding of the different processes and also the stages within these processes. patient groups need to have an effective and ethical working relationship with pharmaceutical companies. That is really important. Pharmaceutical companies are not permitted to contact individual patients. So patient group leaders are in effect the gatekeeper for that relationship and for that information. It's really important that you manage that well. Patient group leaders need a strong relationship with your specialist clinicians. They need good engagement. You need to have good engagement with your community. And importantly, you need good understanding of your community. And not just one voice within your community, but for all the different people in your community. And we know that patient communities are varied in their wants, their needs, their experiences. You also need to be able to have some understanding of your community that sits outside perhaps your membership of your group. So you need to have an understanding of those that you have engaged with and also those that you are failing to engage. Now, don't worry if this sounds daunting. Well, actually, no, before that, as I said, I presume there are many patient group leaders in the audience today. So I do encourage you to take some time for self-reflection. Do you have all this? Because this is what you need before you can do any advocacy, certainly for access to medicines. And if you don't have this, you need to get to work. But don't be too daunted because there is information and support available. So I've just listed some sources of this on the slide. And I know many have lots to say about the Department of Health website, but really is worth taking the time to Google and explore. You will find some really useful information. You will find things that you, such as Pbac agendas and Pbac outcomes. You will be able to find public summary documents, the documents that help explain decisions. The Office of Health Technology Assessment also have a consumer evidence and engagement unit run by a lovely lady, wonderful lady called Dr. Sally Wortley. And if you, as a patient group leader, don't know anything about the unit, shoot her an email, introduce yourself, say hello. Patient Voice Initiative run education and resources on HTA. They're really good. In the rare disease sector, the RVA runs education and mentorship to patient groups. And a lot of, as I said, a lot of what we do around that is around HTA. Both RVA and PVI have a lot of experience in HTA and have strong, effective relationships with key HTA consumer personnel, such as Joe and other key people. So make sure you use them. Okay. So as a patient group leader, I know everyone comes with very different levels of expertise and experience and knowledge and skills, and it's okay to not know all the answers. But what is really important is that you know the questions to ask. You know the questions at which you have to start looking for the answers. And I've just put here a list of the questions that I think if you're a patient community and you have a medicine coming to Pvac, these are really important, vital questions to ask. What makes this medicine different to current treatment options? How is it administered? What is the burden of treatment? How will it help? Who will it help? What will it do? What won't it do? Does the patient community want this? Do I want this? And this is a really important one because we often find this is a real gap for patient groups. Have a really good understanding of what indication the company is applying for in their submission. Is it the whole patient population? Don't presume it is. Or is it just a subset, or are there other restrictions in the application? Has this been assessed by Pvac before? And certainly in the rare disease sector, this is a really common question that we have to ask because often it isn't the first time it's been to Pvac. If it's not the first time, why was it not recommended? What are the remaining uncertainties? And how has this new resubmission addressed these uncertainties? And be really clear about how will the patient voice address these uncertainties? What is my narrative and what is my patient group's narrative? And I'm sure there's more that you can all think of, but that would be a really good start. And where you find the answers for these questions are in a range of sources. First of all, you need to ask your community, ask your clinicians, ask the pharma company. Go searching, find those answers. Okay, and lastly, just to finish up, a few days ago, I attended the Biopharma Dispatch Conference, which, for those that don't know, is a conference largely directed towards industry, although they did say that this year they had a more patient or consumer focus, but for me, I think the jury is still out on that. But anyway, there was a speaker at this conference who said some things which I found quite surprising. She said that she did not really subscribe to the concept of the power of the patient voice in HTA. She acknowledged that while patients having their say and their voice was positive in terms of engagement, she said quite clearly that she felt that individual stories don't really inform or influence decision-making. Instead, she said what was needed was a more formal collection of patient evidence and data. Now, if you're a bit cynical like I am and been around the space for a while like I have, you might say, well, perhaps that's not surprising she said that, because she has made a business of collecting such data. And I was watching online the conference, so put in a question. How do you know that? How do you know that that type of data actually makes a difference for the Pbac? Have you asked them? Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get an answer to my question, but I know what type of input the Pbac asks for. We all do. It's on the consumer comments portal. They specifically ask for individual stories. And the other disconnect between what this speaker was saying and what I know is that I know that particularly in the area of rare disease, individual stories can make a huge difference to the Pbac because I have seen it with my own eyes. At RVA, when we're working with patient groups, we provide support to them to write their consumer comments or supporting them ahead of a consumer meeting. We are often asked, what should we write? What should we say? What do the Pbac want? And what RVA says is that the aim is to provide the narrative behind the data, the stories, the human face. The Pbac already has data in the company's submission. Quite a lot of data, in fact, to which I'm sure that the Pbac members, when they look at the data, they will say, so what? So what does this mean? What does this mean for patients, their families, and what does this look like? A number of years ago, before I actually worked at RVA, I was leading a specific rare disease group, which had a medicine being assessed by the Pbac. And this was the second time it had been to the Pbac. The first time, due to uncertainty, it was not deemed as clinically effective. And there was the feeling that the company, as part of its resubmission, had strengthened the application as much as it could. And at the time, as the patient group leader, I did have a good working relationship with the company. And so I knew from our discussions that they had had a number of conversations with the Pbac in the lead up to this assessment. And apparently that there seemed to be an acceptance that the medicine increased patients walking. And that was probably because one of the tests in the application, the measures of clinical efficacy was a 6-minute walking test. And so my understanding was that the Pbac, there was a general acceptance that yes, they accepted the data that patients can on average on this treatment walk an extra 13 metres. Now, I can't quite remember if it was 13 metres, but it was a figure similar to that. But whatever it was a fairly, I guess, what looked like a fairly modest increase. And so while there might have been acceptance about the data, I think there was certainly uncertainty from the Pbac of whether those extra metres actually made much difference in people's lives. So no doubt, in part due to this uncertainty, the patient group I was leading at the time was offered a consumer hearing. So myself and 2 parents of children who had experienced this drug on a clinical trial were able to speak to Pbac members directly. And what we did was that we were able to provide authentic family stories, individual patient voices of what the extra energy and endurance that was represented by those extra 13 metres really meant. Some of the, one of the parents brought in photos, so we were really able to show the human face behind it. But some of the stories that came up in that consumer hearing included parents saying that their child now had enough energy to play outside with their friends at lunchtime at school, instead of always sitting inside alone. Another story was that a child could now independently walk down the street to their nan's house, and that was really exciting for them.
Hi, Nicole. Sorry to interrupt. I think we need just to wrap up and get to some questions. I'm loving what you're saying, so sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. Look, that was my final point. But just that, I guess there was lots of stories like this at the consumer hearing, and at this time, the Pbac outcome did state it was clinically effective. So, you know, I do think there is great story in the power of the patient voice. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Nicole. And I'm so sorry to interrupt on what I thought was such an interesting point. And I know we're coming to the end, but I'll just ask you and Joe to pop online so we can have some questions. And I think it was really wonderful that you brought out those stories, Nicole, because we know from some of the research coming in overseas that it's really confirming that patient input is so essential to getting this fuller picture of health technology assessment, and particularly when we get to the rare and there's a lack of other evidence. I'm going to go straight to one of the questions I can see here from Janelle Bowden, who said that she's intrigued about the difference between the evaluation for approval, I think that's for TGA, and for reimbursement, as I would have thought much of the same evaluation outside of cost would have been done in both assessments. Joe, is that one you could answer for us?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the question, Janelle. So the TGA does do its own process in terms of looking at quality and safety as the regulator for the medicines before they're able to be registered for use in this country. And as part of that regulatory decision making, they also give what they believe to be the context of the indication for that registration. So in other words, what they want to say is appropriate for the use of that medicine. While that can't just be adopted by the Pvac, and I'll come to that in a minute, we do take the TGA dossiers and all that information, including the delegates' reasons why they have given it a registration in the manner of which they have, and that forms part of the evidentiary basis for the HTA evaluation that Pvac carries out. What we can't do is adopt it lock, stock and barrel, because the Pvac is actually legislated to consider all the evidence in a way that suggests cost effectiveness in comparison to something else. So the clinical registration that TGA gives something is not necessarily going to fit what the Pvac is determined to be the best way to use a medicine in a clinical setting, in a cost-effective way for the purpose of PBS subsidy. So while material and determinations are looked at and reviewed, they have to be looked at and reviewed within a context or through a lens that does a comparative health technology assessment evaluation in those sort of fundamental aspects. And I just finally want to say that that's why you'll often see that a TGA registration is different to a Pvac indication with a set of restrictions for how to use something if you're accessing it through the pharmaceutical benefits scheme with a PBS script versus how you may use something if it's being used in another way through a hospital or a private purchase.
Thanks, Jo. That's very helpful. And Nicole, I'll just try and squeeze in one last question to you. You talked about some of the alternative forms of information and data and some of the questions it might answer. Now, people often think about registries and things like that, but what sort of alternative forms could people think about?
So I've seen a range of different alternate forms. I've seen patient groups present videos as a real way, I guess, to show improvement in function. I've seen people show photos, as I've said, small stories. I think it's important that as patient group leaders, what we do is encourage that the dialogue is around to move away from what I often see as, you know, I just want the drug or I just want the medicine. Because it's not actually very helpful for the Pbac, I think, in making their deliberations, but actually to talk about what difference it makes, and not just around the differences that's in the application, but also in the submission, but around what it makes, you know, what it makes in your own life. And even with RVA, we often have this conversation with patient groups. I still get surprised, even if we're going to see a group and go, well, I reckon that this will be what they'll say. Every time we have that conversation, I get surprised by what someone says, you know, what someone says. There's always something, another aspect to it that we hadn't even thought of. So that's the bit you have to uncover.
And Jo, I know we need to finish, but and you sit there at Pbac. How does Pbac feel about these alternative forms of information?
Yeah, I mean, I think the chair and I are both very willing to accept information or patient inputs in whatever way the patient or the patient group feels they need to make it. I think one of the challenges is a system sort of process where we've got written consumers' comments coming through a portal. We try and encourage people to also, if they're not able to use the portal for whatever reason, to let us know so that we can try and facilitate another way for them to provide their information. And then again, we've got very specific groups who find it very difficult to do anything in writing, and so we end up doing interviews with them and speak with them directly. At the moment, I guess I'm trying to say that we try and ask those who can to use the consumer comments process in the way it is at the moment, so that we can free up what capacity we have for those that need that extra support or that extra facilitated sort of pathway option. But eventually, and you know, in a sort of a dream world of mine and others, we'll have capacity one day to make that a lot more sort of broader for everyone.
Oh, that's a great note to finish on, and I thank you, and I thank you to people for staying online for just a few extra minutes, because I think our presentations were wonderful today. Jo, we heard your voice despite some cyclone going on outside you, I think, and Nicole, despite the fact that someone has been trying to steal your voice this week, and so thank you. I hope you both have a restful weekend, because we learnt a lot this afternoon and we really appreciate your time for it. Next week, we'll be doing our final in our May webinar series, which is going to be on health economics and the patient voice. And we'll have Dr. Sally Wortley here, and also Richard Di Lorenzo, also talking health economics. So you can use your link from today to join us again next week, this time back at our 10 a.m. slot.